Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Daniel Brooks had stopped asking why his golden retriever came home dirty every morning. But the sound that echoed across his kitchen table that Tuesday made his stomach tighten in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't a toy. It wasn't a stick. It was the sharp metallic clink of another house key sliding from Buddy's mouth onto the hardwood floor. Daniel stared at it in silence, then slowly looked toward the old cookie tin sitting beside the coffee maker. Inside were 7 other keys, each completely different, each carried home by the same dog over the past 3 weeks. None belonged to Daniel. None fit his locks. None had a tag, an address, or anything that explained why Buddy kept finding them. Buddy wagged his tail as if he had completed another important job, then sat patiently by the door instead of begging for breakfast like he always did. That was the part Daniel couldn't shake. It didn't feel random anymore. Every weekday, just after sunrise, Buddy would wait by the front door until Daniel left for work. Then, according to the neighbor who occasionally waved from across the street, the dog would disappear for almost an hour before quietly returning alone. Daniel had searched the neighborhood twice, asking if anyone had lost a key. People either laughed or shrugged. One family even thanked Buddy, believing one of the keys belonged to them, until it failed to unlock anything they owned. Somehow the mystery only grew stranger. The keys were all different sizes, different brands, different ages. Some looked brand new. Others were scratched and weathered, as though they had been lying outside for years. Yet Buddy never brought back wallets, phones, collars, or anything else a wandering dog might discover. Only keys. Always keys. Daniel tried keeping Buddy indoors the following morning, but the usually gentle dog paced from window to window with unusual urgency. He refused breakfast, ignored his favorite tennis ball, and stared at the front door with quiet determination until Daniel finally gave in. The instant the leash came off in the fenced backyard, Buddy slipped through a loose section Daniel hadn't noticed before and vanished beyond the trees. 48 minutes later, he returned carrying another key, this one still attached to a faded blue keychain with half its letters worn away. Daniel knelt beside him, turning the key over in his hand while Buddy watched with calm, hopeful eyes, almost as if he expected Daniel to understand something obvious. For the first time, Daniel wasn't thinking about lost property. He was thinking about purpose. Dogs didn't collect random objects this consistently without a reason. Something was drawing Buddy to the same invisible path every single morning. That evening, after lining up all 8 mysterious keys across his kitchen counter, Daniel made a decision. Tomorrow, Buddy would make the trip one more time, but this time, a tiny camera would be clipped beneath his collar. If the dog was hiding a secret, sunrise was about to expose every step of it. Daniel barely slept that night. The tiny camera sat fully charged on the kitchen counter, but instead of feeling relieved, he found himself watching Buddy more than the device. The dog was unusually quiet. Normally, evenings meant chasing a tennis ball across the backyard or nudging Daniel's elbow until he laughed. Now Buddy spent long stretches lying beside the old cookie tin that held the mysterious keys. Every so often, he would lift his head, stare toward the front window, and let out the softest sigh, as though waiting for someone who never arrived. Daniel tried to distract him with a new rope toy from the pet store, but Buddy sniffed it politely and walked away. He filled Buddy's favorite bowl with fresh chicken and rice, yet the dog only took a few bites before returning to his silent post near the window. There was no sign of illness. His tail still wagged whenever Daniel spoke his name, and his bright brown eyes followed every movement around the house. But behind that familiar warmth was a quiet determination that Daniel had never noticed before, as though Buddy carried a responsibility too important to abandon. The next morning, Daniel clipped the tiny camera beneath Buddy's collar with careful hands. Buddy stood perfectly still during the process, almost as if he understood the moment mattered. When Daniel finished adjusting the strap, the dog gently pressed his nose against Daniel's arm for several seconds before walking to the front door. It was a simple gesture, but it felt strangely different from his usual affection. It was not excitement. It was reassurance. Daniel opened the door, expecting Buddy to sprint away like he always did. Instead, the dog paused on the porch and looked back over his shoulder. Their eyes met in complete silence. Daniel smiled nervously and whispered, "Go ahead, Buddy." Only then did Buddy trot down the driveway and disappear beyond the maple trees lining the street. The neighborhood slowly came alive with familiar routines. School buses rolled past. Lawn sprinklers clicked across freshly cut grass. Neighbors collected newspapers from their front steps. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that Buddy was moving through a completely different world hidden inside the same quiet streets. He tried making coffee, answered a few work emails from home, and glanced at the clock every few minutes. 48 minutes passed. Then 52. Buddy had never been late before. Daniel stepped onto the porch, scanning both ends of the road. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, but there was no sign of golden fur. 5 more anxious minutes crawled by before Buddy finally emerged from the tree line. His pace was slower than usual. His ears were lowered, and instead of proudly carrying another key high in his mouth, he held it with remarkable care, almost delicately, as though it belonged to someone precious. When he reached Daniel, he gently placed the key into his open hand and rested his head against Daniel's knee without making a sound. Daniel instinctively reached down to pet him, but something caught his attention. Mixed. Among the dust on Buddy's front paws was a faint streak of pale blue chalk, and tucked deep inside the fur near his collar was a tiny dried flower that certainly had not been there when Buddy left home. Daniel carried the tiny camera inside with trembling hands, but he resisted the urge to watch the recording immediately. Something about Buddy's behavior felt more urgent than the footage itself. The dog refused to leave the kitchen, circling the cookie tin 3 times before carefully nudging it several inches closer to the back door. It was not playful. It was deliberate. When Daniel moved the tin back onto the counter, Buddy quietly returned it to the floor again. The strange ritual repeated 4 times before Daniel finally gave up and left it where Buddy seemed to want it. That evening, another odd pattern emerged. Every few minutes, Buddy would walk to the hallway closet, touch the doorknob gently with his nose, then return to the cookie tin without taking his eyes off it. Daniel opened the closet, expecting to find a forgotten toy or perhaps another lost key hidden inside a jacket pocket, but there was nothing unusual. Buddy watched the search patiently, then sighed and walked away as though Daniel had missed something important. By the following morning, the routine had become even stranger. Before sunrise, instead of waiting at the front door, Buddy carried the newest key to the living room and carefully lined it beside the other 8 keys Daniel had arranged on the coffee table. Then, using only his nose, he slowly pushed each key until they formed a neat row. Daniel stared in disbelief. Buddy had never been trained to organize objects. Yet he refused to leave until every key pointed in exactly the same direction. As soon as Daniel accidentally bumped one while reaching for his coffee mug, Buddy immediately nudged it back into place. It almost looked as though the order mattered. Daniel found himself taking photographs before leaving for work, unable to explain why such a simple act unsettled him so deeply. Later that afternoon, his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Harper, knocked on the door carrying a puzzled expression. She asked if Buddy had been wandering near Maple Park because several people had noticed a friendly golden retriever stopping at different benches without approaching anyone. One man claimed the dog would place something on the ground, step back several feet, wait quietly for a minute, and then pick it up again before leaving. Daniel forced a smile, saying Buddy must simply enjoy exploring, but the story stayed with him long after Mrs. Harper returned home. That night, he finally decided to review only a few seconds of the camera footage. Yet before he could even insert the memory card into his laptop, Buddy suddenly stood up from across the room. Without barking or whining, he walked directly to Daniel, gently took the camera between his teeth, and carried it into the hallway. Then he stopped beneath the family photo hanging on the wall, looked up at the picture, looked back at Daniel, and for the very first time since the mysterious keys had appeared, Buddy slowly shook his head from side to side, as if pleading with him not to watch it there. Daniel stood frozen beneath the family photograph, the tiny camera still resting gently between Buddy's teeth. Nothing about the dog's behavior looked aggressive or unpredictable, yet everything about it felt impossible to explain. After several long seconds, Buddy quietly lowered the camera onto the floor and stepped back, watching Daniel with an expression that seemed almost pleading. Daniel finally picked it up and carried it into his home office instead. He told himself he was simply choosing a quieter place to review the footage, but deep inside, an uncomfortable thought had already begun to grow. What if Buddy was no longer acting like himself because something was wrong? The question followed Daniel throughout the day. Buddy continued arranging the keys with unusual precision, refused to leave them unattended, and became visibly unsettled whenever Daniel tried placing them inside a drawer instead of the cookie tin. He never growled or snapped. Instead, he would gently remove the keys one by one, carry them back to the tin, and sit beside them for hours without moving. The quiet determination that once seemed admirable was beginning to look obsessive. Daniel scheduled an appointment with their longtime veterinarian, Dr. Emily Foster, hoping she might recognize signs of stress or cognitive changes. During the examination, Buddy remained calm, wagging his tail politely at every member of the staff. His heartbeat was normal. His eyes were bright. His reflexes were excellent. Dr. Foster smiled reassuringly before becoming more thoughtful as Daniel described the mysterious keys and the increasingly unusual routines. She admitted there were no obvious medical concerns, but she gently suggested that repetitive collecting behaviors could sometimes become unhealthy if left unchecked. She recommended limiting Buddy's opportunities to wander alone for a while and observing whether the unusual habits faded. Daniel thanked her, but the advice felt heavier than he expected. Restricting Buddy's freedom sounded reasonable, yet something about it felt unfair. On the drive home, Buddy rested his head quietly against the passenger door, staring out the window instead of watching Daniel the way he usually did. That evening, Daniel repaired the loose section of the backyard fence and secured the side gate with an extra latch. He hated doing it, but he convinced himself it was temporary. Buddy walked the entire perimeter of the yard twice before returning to the porch. Instead of trying to escape, he simply sat facing the closed gate, his ears lifted toward the distant neighborhood as if listening for something only he could hear. The following morning, Daniel kept Buddy inside despite the dog's silent wait by the front door. Minutes passed, then an hour. Buddy never barked or scratched at the door. He simply carried the cookie tin to Daniel's feet and laid down beside it, refusing to look away from the entrance. The quiet loyalty only made Daniel feel worse. Late that afternoon, Mrs. Harper knocked again, this time with genuine concern. She explained that several neighbors had begun talking about the mysterious dog collecting keys from around the community. One family had already changed their locks after noticing a missing spare key. Another neighbor wondered whether Buddy had been trained to retrieve valuables without anyone noticing. Daniel immediately defended his dog, but the rumors were spreading faster than he could answer them. Before the conversation ended, Mrs. Harper hesitated, lowered her voice, and admitted that someone on the neighborhood association had already suggested calling animal control if Buddy was seen wandering with another key again. Daniel closed the door with a sinking heart, unaware that upstairs, Buddy had quietly picked up every single key from the cookie tin and placed them carefully in front of the locked back door as though he knew time was running out. Daniel could not ignore the growing uneasiness that settled over the house after Buddy gathered every key beside the locked back door. The neighbor's concerns echoed in his mind, and for the first time he wondered whether keeping Buddy confined was protecting the community or simply punishing a dog he did not yet understand. The following morning he left for work with a heavy heart, checking the security app on his phone every hour. Buddy spent most of the morning lying quietly beside the cookie tin, never touching the food in his bowl until nearly noon. It was not refusal or stubbornness. It was patience, as though he was waiting for something outside the fence to happen before allowing himself to relax. That afternoon, Daniel returned home earlier than expected after receiving a message from Dr. Emily Foster. She explained that she had been thinking about Buddy's unusual behavior ever since their appointment. She admitted she had seen dogs repeatedly collect toys, shoes, or even socks, but never unrelated house keys gathered over such a short period. Something about the pattern bothered her enough that she asked Daniel if she could examine the keys themselves instead of Buddy. Curious, Daniel carried the cookie tin to her clinic before closing time. Dr. Foster carefully spread the keys across a stainless steel examination table under a bright inspection lamp. She did not begin by looking at the metal. Instead, she noticed the small details clinging to them. One key carried traces of pale blue sidewalk chalk inside its grooves. Another had tiny grains of reddish sand caught beneath the key ring. A third held the faint scent of lavender, so subtle that she only recognized it because dried lavender was often used in handmade fabric sachets. Then she paused over something even stranger. Nearly every key had an identical thin scratch crossing one side at almost the same angle. It looked too consistent to be random wear, but too shallow to have been made by force. Dr. Foster frowned thoughtfully and reached for a magnifying glass. The marks appeared fresh on some keys and older on others, suggesting they had all rubbed against the same rough surface repeatedly before Buddy ever found them. Daniel quietly watched her expression change from professional curiosity to genuine concentration. She finally looked up and asked a simple question that immediately changed the direction of the conversation. "Did Buddy ever bring you 2 keys from the same place on the same day?" Daniel thought carefully before shaking his head. Never. It had always been 1 key each morning, almost as though Buddy believed every trip had only one destination. Dr. Foster slowly gathered the keys back together without answering right away. She then pointed to the dried flower still tucked safely inside the cookie tin, the one Daniel had absent-mindedly placed there after removing it from Buddy's fur. Unlike the flower, which had become brittle after several days indoors, the lavender scent on one of the keys was unexpectedly fresh. Someone had handled that key recently. "If these were random objects scattered across town," she said softly, "they would not keep carrying pieces of the same story." Daniel felt a chill despite the warm room. For weeks, he had been staring at the mystery without noticing that the clues belonged together. Dr. Foster carefully closed the cookie tin and slid it back toward him. "Do not throw these away," she said, "and do not assume Buddy is collecting them. I think he may be returning to the same place for a reason we have not recognized yet." Daniel nodded silently, left the clinic with the tin resting on the passenger seat beside him, and before driving home, made one quiet decision. Tomorrow he would retrace every minute of Buddy's morning route from the very beginning, no matter where it led. The next morning Daniel left before dawn, parking his truck nearly half a mile from home so Buddy would not notice him right away. He waited until the familiar golden shape slipped quietly through the repaired gate just as the neighborhood began to wake. Instead of running aimlessly as everyone had imagined, Buddy followed an almost perfectly repeated route, crossing the same sidewalks, pausing at the same intersections, and ignoring every distraction along the way. Squirrels darted across the grass. Joggers passed within a few feet. Another dog barked excitedly from behind a fence. Buddy never turned his head. It was as though he had memorized a destination that mattered more than anything else. Daniel stayed well behind, careful not to lose sight of him. Nearly 40 minutes later, Buddy entered Maple Park, but instead of stopping at the benches where neighbors claimed they had seen him, he continued toward an older section of the park that few people visited anymore. There stood a small community garden surrounded by white wooden fencing, its entrance decorated with pots of lavender and faded blue chalk drawings covering the nearby sidewalk. Daniel immediately recognized both details from the mysterious keys. Buddy slowed his pace and gently lowered his nose to the ground, searching in wide circles before suddenly stopping beside a weathered stone path. Hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves was another house key. Buddy carefully picked it up without scratching it and continued deeper into the garden until he reached a quiet woman sitting alone on a bench beneath an old oak tree. She appeared to be in her late 70s, neatly dressed, but slightly confused as she searched through an empty handbag for something that was clearly missing. Buddy did not run to her. He calmly placed the key on the bench beside her hand, then stepped back several feet and waited. The woman looked down, smiled with visible relief, and whispered, "There you are. I thought I had lost you again." She placed the key into her purse without the slightest surprise, stood up, and slowly walked toward a nearby cottage at the edge of the park. Daniel remained frozen behind a hedge, unable to understand what he had just witnessed. Before he could move, Buddy quietly returned to the stone path and resumed searching. Minutes later, he uncovered another key hidden beneath flowering plants, then another resting near a garden hose. He never carried those away. Instead, he gently pushed each one into places where the woman would easily notice them during her next visit. The cookie tin at home had never been a collection of stolen keys. They were the only ones Buddy had found after the woman had already gone home. keys he could not return before she disappeared. Every morning he came back, hoping to finish a job he believed was incomplete. Daniel watched as the woman reached her cottage, unlocked the front door with the key Buddy had just recovered, and disappeared safely inside. A few moments later, Buddy quietly sat outside the closed gate without asking for praise, his eyes fixed on the little house, as though making certain she was truly home. In that instant, every strange habit suddenly made perfect sense. The careful arrangement of the keys, the refusal to hide them, the urgency to leave every sunrise, the fresh lavender, the blue chalk, even the dried flower caught in his fur. Buddy had never been collecting anything for himself. He had been protecting a fragile daily routine that no one else had noticed. Daniel felt his chest tighten as he realized the heartbreaking truth. While everyone, including him, had been trying to stop Buddy, the dog had been spending every morning making sure a lonely woman with fading memories could still find her way back to her own front door. Daniel remained hidden behind the hedge long after the elderly woman had disappeared inside her little cottage. Buddy did not rush after her or wait for praise. Instead, he quietly walked to the edge of the garden, lay beneath the old oak tree, and watched the front porch from a respectful distance, almost like a silent guardian making certain another ordinary morning had ended safely. Daniel felt a weight settle over him that was far heavier than surprise. Every memory from the past 3 weeks returned with painful clarity. The cookie tin Buddy had insisted on protecting was never a trophy box. The careful way he lined up each key was not obsession but order, making sure none would be forgotten. Even carrying the tin to the back door had been an attempt to show Daniel where the unfinished task still waited. Daniel had mistaken loyalty for confusion and purpose for unhealthy behavior. He lowered his head, ashamed that he had repaired the fence, locked the gate, and nearly taken away the one thing Buddy had cared about more than his own routine. Buddy slowly stood and began walking toward him. There was no excitement in his steps, no expectation of affection, only the same calm expression he had worn every morning. When he reached Daniel, he gently leaned his shoulder against Daniel's leg for just a moment before looking back toward the cottage, quietly reminding him that someone else still mattered more than either of them. Daniel dropped to one knee and wrapped both arms around Buddy's neck. The dog remained perfectly still, accepting the embrace with quiet patience instead of celebration. Daniel realized that Buddy had never needed to be forgiven because he had done nothing wrong. The one who needed forgiveness was standing there holding back tears. On the drive home, Daniel could barely focus on the road. Every rumor from the neighborhood now sounded painfully unfair. Every suspicious glance Buddy had received felt undeserved. The thought that animal control might have been called because of a dog trying to help a vulnerable neighbor left him with a deep sense of regret he could not easily shake. As soon as he arrived home, Daniel called Dr. Emily Foster and asked her to come over that evening. When she listened to everything he had witnessed, she sat quietly for several seconds before smiling in disbelief. She admitted that even after years of caring for animals, she had rarely seen such patient, consistent problem-solving motivated entirely by concern for another living person. Together they opened the cookie tin once more. This time the remaining keys no longer looked mysterious. They looked like unfinished promises waiting to be returned. Dr. Foster suggested they identify each one carefully instead of leaving them forgotten in a drawer. Daniel agreed immediately. He also contacted Mrs. Harper, not to argue with the neighbors, but to ask her to postpone any discussion about animal control until everyone understood the full story. For the first time since the strange events had begun, Daniel spoke about Buddy with quiet pride instead of uncertainty. Later that evening, Buddy carried the cookie tin to Daniel one more time, placing it gently between them before lying down at his feet. Daniel smiled through wet eyes, opened the lid, and softly rested his hand on Buddy's head. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we finish this together." Buddy lifted his tail with one slow, gentle wag, and for the first time in weeks Daniel understood exactly what that simple movement meant. It was not relief for himself. It was hope for the woman who still did not know how many mornings one faithful dog had spent making sure she could always find her way home. The following morning, Daniel and Dr. Emily Foster returned to Maple Park carrying the cookie tin instead of hiding it away. Buddy walked ahead at his usual steady pace, but this time Daniel did not try to redirect him or shorten the walk. He trusted every turn the dog chose. As they reached the community garden, the elderly woman was already tending a row of wildflowers, humming softly while searching through her pockets with the familiar uncertainty Buddy had recognized long before anyone else. Without hesitation, Buddy trotted toward a flower bed, paused beside a flat stone, and gently uncovered another small key that had slipped beneath the soil after a recent rain. Rather than carrying it away, he placed it on the edge of the garden path where the morning sunlight made the metal sparkle. The woman noticed it almost immediately. Her face brightened with quiet relief as she picked it up and smiled to herself before carefully placing it inside her purse. Daniel realized that Buddy had never wanted attention. He simply wanted the keys to be easy for her to find. Over the next hour, Daniel and Dr. Foster walked through the garden with the woman, introducing themselves gently and learning that her name was Margaret Wilson. She happily explained that she loved tending flowers every morning, but sometimes forgot where she had placed her keys after becoming distracted by a blooming plant or a passing bird. She laughed about it with surprising warmth, unaware of how many times Buddy had quietly solved the problem before anyone else noticed. Dr. Foster suggested attaching brightly colored floating key tags that would stand out against the grass and flower beds without making Margaret feel embarrassed. Daniel offered to help install them that afternoon. Margaret accepted with grateful surprise, believing it was simply a thoughtful neighborhood gesture. She never realized that the idea had come from watching a faithful dog perform the same act of kindness day after day. News of Buddy's true routine gradually spread through the neighborhood after Mrs. Harper shared the complete story at the community association meeting. The conversation that had once centered on suspicion slowly transformed into admiration. Instead of discussing complaints, neighbors began checking sidewalks and park paths each morning for misplaced belongings before they became problems. Several families even volunteered to keep an eye on elderly residents who lived alone, quietly inspired by the example one gentle dog had set without ever asking for recognition. A small wooden box was later placed near the entrance of the community garden with a handwritten sign that read, "Lost keys and found kindness." Anyone who discovered a misplaced key could leave it there for its owner to retrieve. Buddy immediately understood its purpose. Within days, he stopped carrying keys home altogether. Whenever he discovered one, he calmly placed it inside the little box before continuing his walk. Daniel watched the change with a smile that carried no sadness, only gratitude. The cookie tin that had once held unanswered questions was now empty, resting quietly on a shelf where it no longer represented mystery, but trust. As the afternoon sun settled across the garden, Buddy wandered to the old oak tree and lay beneath its shade while Margaret watered her flowers nearby. He no longer watched every movement with anxious determination. His breathing slowed. His ears relaxed. For the first time since the strange journey had begun, Buddy closed his eyes completely, knowing that the responsibility he had carried alone for so many mornings was finally being shared by people who had learned to see the world through his quiet acts of compassion. Weeks slowly turned into months, and the quiet rhythm of Maple Park settled into something beautifully familiar. Every morning, Margaret Wilson walked through the community garden with a small canvas bag hanging from her shoulder, its colorful key tags catching the sunlight exactly as Dr. Emily Foster had hoped they would. She still misplaced a key from time to time, but now it was never truly lost for long. The little wooden box near the entrance had become a symbol of kindness rather than forgetfulness. Children walking to school would stop to check whether someone had left a missing key behind. Garden volunteers gently reminded one another to look before leaving. Visitors who had never met Margaret quietly placed found belongings inside without expecting thanks. One faithful dog's silent routine had become a habit shared by an entire neighborhood. But he never seemed interested in the attention that followed. When neighbors called his name or reached down to pet him, he accepted every gentle scratch with the same calm expression he had always worn before wandering back toward the winding garden paths. Sometimes he would pause beneath the old oak tree where everything had changed, lift his nose toward the breeze, and continue walking as though he were still checking that every piece of the morning belonged exactly where it should. Daniel often watched from a nearby bench, smiling whenever someone praised Buddy for being extraordinary. He knew the truth was much quieter than that. Buddy had never tried to become anyone's hero. He had simply refused to ignore a problem that everyone else had walked past without seeing. The old cookie tin remained in Daniel's kitchen, but it no longer held mysterious keys. Instead, it contained a few pressed lavender flowers, one faded blue piece of sidewalk chalk, and the tiny dried blossom that Daniel had first found tangled in Buddy's fur. Whenever friends asked why he kept such ordinary things, Daniel would place the tin on the table and tell the story from the beginning, never leaving out the part where he had nearly misunderstood the one friend who had been trying hardest to do the right thing. Every time he reached that moment, he found himself speaking a little more softly than before. Margaret also changed in small but meaningful ways. Although some memories continued to fade with time, she never forgot to wave whenever Buddy entered the garden. She began leaving a fresh bowl of water beneath the oak tree each morning, not because Buddy needed a reward, but because she believed every guardian deserved a place to rest. Buddy always drank a few quiet sips before continuing his slow walk through the flowers, and somehow that simple routine became the part of the morning everyone looked forward to most. Years later, new families moved into the neighborhood without knowing how the little wooden box had first appeared beside the garden gate. They simply accepted it as part of the community, another ordinary tradition in a place where neighbors looked after one another. Only Daniel knew that the entire tradition had begun with a dog carrying home objects that no one understood. Whenever he remembered those confusing mornings, he no longer felt embarrassed by his mistake. Instead, he felt grateful that Buddy had loved someone enough to keep trying even when no one believed he had a reason. Some hearts never ask to be understood. They simply keep doing what is right until the world finally learns to see.